Before Amtrak, Carl was fortunate to ride almost all of the great trains, including the 20th Century Limited, the Broadway Limited, the Super Chief, Florida Special, Phoebe Snow, Denver, California and Texas Zephyrs, and many more. Carl has ridden every active Amtrak route, as well as lost services like the North Coast Hiawatha. He made the original proposal for the daylight Vermonter to the state of Vermont in 1995 to replace the Montrealer. Carl is also a 50-year-plus member of the Rail Passenger Association and was a past vice chair and board member. He's also a member of multiple NRHS and other railway preservation groups and has been a member of the Vermont Rail Advisory Council to V-Trains for almost 20 years. So Carl, we're going to hand it off to you, and thank you for presenting tonight. Let's get started.
Thank you. Am I audible properly? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Good. Excellent. All right. This is a slideshow about a trip you can't take, which sounds a little weird, but in those years that we ran Rail Travel Center, Rail Travel Adventures, the most commonly asked question that we couldn't help anyone with was, I want to take the train to Alaska. And we would always say to the client, well, unfortunately, you can't do that, but you can take trains in Alaska. And they'd go, oh, no, I saw it on TV. I know we can do it. Well, you can't now, and you couldn't then, but you could do an awful lot of it. And so this program sort of follows what did exist on the assumption that we're trying to get from the Pacific Northwest, which was the jumping off point for the gold rush up there, up to Alaska and doing as much as possible by rail. And so we begin. We begin with the Talgo service on the Cascades trains between Eugene, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. Now, this, of course, ended up being a tragic service in 1918 when the Talgo derailed at high speed on a sharp curve and destroyed the Mount Adams Talgo set. Particularly painful to me because I had two of my best friends on that train, and they were two of the three who were killed. But it was a magnificent ride, and the line would have been the beginning of the railway to Alaska. This route was jointly controlled historically by the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern, and also shared by the Union Pacific. And we look at the route mapping here. You can see that at the time I set up this program, the trains were still going through the right-hand map on the green line. Subsequently, they have been relocated to the orange line, which was built as the original NP main line, actually, to Tacoma and Seattle, but had long been downgraded to being a very
Carl?
secondary freight branch.
We're not seeing your screen at this point.
Aha, we got to share, but you're not getting the screen. Well, we're going to start that over again and condense the first couple of slides. So we're going to try to take a train ride as far to Alaska as is possible or ever was possible, using such lines as were completed. And along the way, we'll also look at a couple of what might have been. So again, we started with the shared main line between Portland and Seattle. That was the joint operation of the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific historically, with UP as a guest. In later years has been all part of BNSF, with Amtrak as the resident guest. And we're showing again the lovely Talgo trains that for many years provided the corridor service in that line. Two of these are still in service, a more up-to-date version that is assumed to survive collisions better. But the accident that killed my friends was the sort of perfect storm of awfulness. New engineer not experienced in the first run over the new line, the line in orange on the right, missed 3 warning signs telling him there was a 30-mile-an-hour curve, and took a 30-mile-an-hour curve over an interstate highway at 80 miles an hour. And the Talgo train went flying, came down on the interstate, and again, 3 people were killed, 2 of whom, alas, were dear friends of mine. Tacoma was the first jumping off point for the Northwest Transcontinental Railways. The Northern Pacific's original terminal was not Seattle, it was Tacoma. And in the left panel, you can see the arches of Tacoma Union Station, another product of Mead and Stem, the people who did Grand Central. In the foreground is the fairly short Sound Transit Tacoma trolley streetcar, which at the time I took these pictures had about a 2.5-mile line. It's now just been expanded to about 5 miles long. The interior was magnificent, soaring arches. The artwork is by the great Native American glassmaker, Del Chihuly. All of the railways in the areas we're going to go through were heavily impacted by logging railroads. And of course, they like to use Shea locomotives. And see on the Mount Rainier Scenic Railway, a Rainier one here. But there were big engines on the main line as well. This was the last visit by the Southern Pacific's magnificent 4449 to the line before Amtrak banned steam engines. This was in the NRHS convention in 2011. You get an idea of the beauty of the line along the point in Tacoma. But again, the line was actually the joint property of the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific, and north of Seattle, it was Great Northern only. The magnificent empire builder connected to a train called the International at Seattle. At Vancouver, there was a connection to the British Columbia Railway, which originally was the Pacific Great Eastern. And in its first guise, you took a steamer up the fjord you see on the right, and eventually boarded a train about 45 miles north of Vancouver and went through to Prince George. But in later years, the province of British Columbia completed the line all the way from Prince George to Vancouver and north another 600 miles to Fort Nelson in the northern part of British Columbia. And this was and is one of the most scenic railway lines in the world, although at present, the Canadian National, which has taken it over, is actually not running any regular freight service south of Williams Lake, which I don't know if my cursor will show or not, but this stretch between Williams Lake and Vancouver is only served at the moment by passenger trains. And the passenger train runs once a week by the Rocky Mountaineer Tour Train folks. But at the moment, again, it's the only train on this line, and boy, what a line. 500 miles from Vancouver up to Prince George is one of the most stunning one-day trips in all of North America when the Bud cars were running on a regular basis. And it's no slouch with the locomotive hauled trains of the Rocky Mountaineer either. For a period in the 1980s into the early 2000s, the British Columbia Railway operated steam on a regular basis in the summer along the southernmost portion of it between Squamish and North Vancouver. They had both a Royal Hudson and they had this big Canadian Pacific 280, which covered the line. But most of the time, the service was Bud cars. This was the longest Bud car service in the world after the demise of the Western Pacific's Salt Lake to San Francisco Bud, which came off way back in the early 1960s. British Columbia Railway called this train the Caribou Dayliner. And again, it ran initially at least 7 days a week. In later years, only 3 times a week north of Lillooet from North Vancouver to Prince George. And if the line had ever gone to Alaska, this would have been the beginning of the ride. The most spectacular part of it is probably this ascent. In 26 miles, British Columbia Railway climbs 3,000 feet from the Fraser River Gorge at Lillooet up to the plateau called the Caribou Plateau. And these are the views off that ascent. It's a sustained 3% grade for over 20 miles. And at the top is one of the most amazing views down into a canyon on any railway line you'll ever see. There is, again, still service, but only once a week. CN cannot abandon this line. They leased it from the province of British Columbia, and part of the deal was they would retain it and keep it in operating condition. But they've chosen to send the freight 300 miles longer to avoid this steep grade. Freight going down to Vancouver now gets to Prince George, goes all the way to Jasper, which of course at the moment is half burned out, and then back down to Vancouver. Again, just to take a momentary glance at this spectacular ascent. British Columbia Railway is a succession of magnificent trestles and viaducts. In the 1990s, my company and a partner company, Mountain Outlands Tours down in California, chartered Bud cars to run the entire length of the British Columbia Railway. These were 1 week-long tours with overnights in hotels, and we went 1,000 miles north from Vancouver when we did this. This, however, is a trestle just south of Prince George in the stretch which had regular passenger service until about 2008. On those runs, we could get regular Bud car run-bys. These 2 Buds ended up in Rhode Island, out on the Rhode Island Railway out by Newport. This is a tunnel under the Continental Divide, north of Prince George, heading for Fort Nelson, which again was 1,000 miles north of Vancouver. Now notice the reference to the Dease Lake branch line. This is the route that actually would have gone to Whitehorse and made a connection to the White Pass and Yukon, where it was also expected the Alaska Railroad would have come down from Fairbanks and made a connection to finally complete a through railway all the way to Alaska. In the 1980s, the province completed the line to Dease Lake almost, when there was a change of government and they suddenly walked away from the project with the rail sitting on the ties waiting to be spiked down, but it was never completed. The native people of the north now use it to go to their villages using ATVs, but the Dease Lake branch was never completed. What was completed was a fully electrified main line with a double crossing of the Continental Divide to coal mines, rich coal mines, to take coal out to Korea. The portion up on the divide again was electrified, but the electrification didn't go very far, and it now has been disconnected and the coal mines have closed. But when I took these pictures in the 1990s, it was very much a going thing. Large motors of the same type that were used on the Black Mesa and Lake Powell out in Arizona. Mountie met us at Fort Nelson, showing us his red surge. Most of the time they actually wear blue now, but it does look good. In the far north, portion of the railway which had passenger service for only about 5 years, the line has some truly unknown but magnificent scenery. This is heading for the Peace River far below. You are running along the Caribou Plateau and you come over a ridge and you look down about 1,500 feet to the railway, several switchbacks below, before it crosses over the Peace River. And this is an area of a triple continental divide. The waters you see here are actually going to the Arctic Ocean. But earlier, the line was following rivers that went to the Pacific, and had we gone about 25 miles east of Prince George, we would have been in drainages of rivers going to the Hudson Bay and eventually to the Atlantic. This is an example of frugality in the north of BC, a railway bridge, which is also the local highway bridge across the river near Fort Nelson. And at the far end of the line, wheat fields. 1,000 miles north of Vancouver is a microclimate, and they grow grain. But what in fact got us even closer was a dream of a man named George Melville Hayes, who constructed the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway using the name of the original mainline railroad in eastern Canada, the Grand Trunk Line. Hayes went down on the Titanic with several $1 million in bonds on his luggage and was lost. He had been building a line from Montreal down to Portland, which was never finished. This one to Prince George and Prince Rupert on the Inside Passage was completed. One of Hayes's eccentricities is that he named stations alphabetically, starting with A and going up to Z, on most of the railways that he opened up. This is still provided tri-weekly passenger service by Via Rail Canada, and the route is one of the unknown jewels of North America from a scenic standpoint. Look at the map here, you can see not only the line that was completed up in the upper left-hand corner as far as Prince Rupert, but also some other dreams that existed, lines heading again north towards Alaska and the entire length of Vancouver Island down at the bottom. But again, the only things that were completed are the line on the right-hand side, which when this map, which was put out about 1930, came out, was still a dotted line. But the line from North Vancouver on the right-hand side all the way to the main line was completed, and the main line was finished to Prince Rupert. And this today is an extremely important line for the transport of containers and freight to the Orient, to Japan, to China, to Korea. And this is the way the coal went out from the northern part of BC to Korea until the coal mines closed. But again, there is a tri-weekly Via Rail train called the Skeena. And here's some pictures of the Skeena. It's a pocket dome liner. A couple of Bud-built 1954 coaches from the Canadian and one of the Park observation lounge cars from the Canadian. This takes 2 days, doesn't run at night. You go from Jasper to Prince George the first day and stay in a hotel. And that part is shut down until the damage from the forest fire in Jasper is completed, fixed. And then the second day you go on from Prince George to Prince Rupert. Again, an incredibly scenic line. I took these pictures in 2016. The car just ahead of the dome was a glass-topped single-level car, which Via owns 3 of, but which had actually been built for British Columbia Railway originally for a tour train they were going to run, which only operated actually for about 1.5 to 2 years. Via again owns 3 of those cars, but they're also modeled on equipment that the Rocky Mountaineer is using even in the United States now between Denver and the national parks of Utah. A new train called Rockies to Red Rocks. As you approach the sea, the line runs down a series of fjords, and this is in fact the Inside Passage. Again, no railway was ever completed all the way to Alaska, but the pioneers went by steamer, initially from the Seattle-Tacoma area. In later years, you could have done it from Prince Rupert as well. And today, it's still possible to do that. The Alaska State Ferry system still runs ferries to Skagway you can drive your car on, and they also provide walk-on service. This is the magnificence of the northern part of the Inside Passage from the Alaska State Ferry, the Matanuska, in the month of August 2006. It was a kind of gloomy month, but magnificent scenery. What we're looking at, however, here is a very tragic spot in Alaskan history. This is where this Canadian Pacific steamer, the SS Princess Sophia, went down on the eve of World War I in 1914. She was bringing the pioneers down from Dawson at the end of the summer mining season, millionaires all over the boat. When she struck a reef, didn't seem to be much of a problem. The captain in the morning actually waved off some rescue ships, assuming that as soon as the high tide came in, he'd get off the rocks. But the high tide came in with an 80-mile-an-hour gale, and the Sophia, broke in half and went to the bottom. The only survivor was a dog who swam ashore. We're approaching Skagway here, the beginning point, jumping off point for the White Pass and Yukon Railway. Now, this is a map of the railroads that actually at one time or another did operate in Alaska. Start from the right-hand side. What we're approaching is the White Pass and Yukon from Skagway to Whitehorse, a 3-foot narrow gauge line. If you look to the left of it at Yakutat, it's the Yakutat Southern Railway, also known as the Situk Railway, the railway that ran by the tide. Go a little bit further to the left, perhaps the most remarkable railroad ever built in Alaska, the Copper River Northwestern, which will have extensive slide coverage here shortly, which was abandoned in 1939, but was really quite something. Then the long blue line, which is the Alaska Railroad, which actually first was the Alaska Southern, then the Alaska Central, then the Government Railroad, and then finally the Alaska Railroad. At the top, above Fairbanks, was a narrow gauge network. It's called the Tanana Valley Railroad, which actually also partially shared the first 40 miles or so of the Alaska Railroad's route south of Fairbanks. And finally, way to the west at Nome, a tiny little cluster of narrow gauge lines that kept going bankrupt and then reviving themselves, and whose equipment still sits out in the tundra to this day, although it has not operated for almost 60 years. So let's look at the railroads that actually did make it to Alaska. And we'll start with and this of course just threw me out and back, just a moment. One of those nights tonight. All right. Trying again. I'm just going to have to run through it until we get to that slide. A little dizzying, and I apologize for that. Zoom is great, except like this one, it isn't. In 1898, gold was discovered in the Yukon Territory at Dawson. This was about 600 miles to the north of Skagway and Dyea, to the north of the upper end of the Inside Passage. But it was one of the richest gold strikes in the history of the world, and it's caused a stampede from the lower 48 and from virtually every Canadian province in 1898 to get there before everybody else. One of the ironies, of course, was that the discovery was actually in 1897, and by the time most of the stampeders finally got to Dawson, the really good claims had pretty well been staked out. But they had an epic of travel to get there. They could take a pretty comfortable steamboat from the US or from the Canadian coastal areas to Skagway, but then they had to march overland to a nearby town called Dyea and then climb uphill 3,200 feet to the Chilkoot Pass above Dyea. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at the border, which was at the summit of the pass, had a customs immigration check station where they required you to prove that you had the equivalent of a full year of supplies with you, or essentially 1,000 pounds of supplies. To get that up to the pass, which had no road, you had to make 15 or 20 trips up this great human chain up. The final piece was about 1.5 miles of almost 40% grades to get to the summit. Eventually, aerial tramways were strung along part of it, but it was a staggering accomplishment. And the Mounties weren't kidding. You could go into Canada, but not only did you have to prove that you had enough supplies to last a year, but you had to give up your guns. Their Mounties would actually check for stuff at the border. If you didn't give up your guns, you were immediately deported. Now, the great Mountie Sam Steele, the most famous Mountie who ever lived, later on in Dawson itself, about 2 years later, was approached by an American miner who said, "Sam, you said I couldn't have my gun, but I got it." And took his revolver out. Sam looked at it and said, "No, you don't, son, I do," and punched him out and lights out. But there was a desperate desire to have something better than the Chilkoot Pass to make the trip. More directly above Skagway was the possibility of a horse trail over the White Pass, which was only a little over 2,000 feet high, but actually even more difficult canyon country than over by Dyea. In the first year of the White Pass, several thousand horses perished trying to drag supplies up over that pass, and there was considerable agitation to build a railroad. A brilliant engineer named Henny came up and figured a way actually to survey a railway up to the pass. Construction began in 1898, and it reached the White Pass summit in June, where the Mounties again had a border position, not only to stop the stampeders to make sure they had all those supplies and no guns, but also to advise the railroad, you're going to go on no further until we are advised that Parliament has given you a license to construct in Canada. They managed to get that in time to reach the lake country at Lake Bennett, actually the headwaters of the Yukon River, later that summer. And by then you could take the train to Bennett, but there you had to build your own boat and float almost 500 miles down the Yukon River through a sequence of rapids and lakes and high water all the way to Dawson. It was a remarkable thing to do, and we'll see some evidence of what kind of country was involved here in just a moment. We are really hot-fingered tonight. Within the first 5 miles out of Skagway, the White Pass and Yukon begins an extraordinarily steep climb to the White Pass summit. To put this in perspective, from Skagway to the summit in about 20 miles, the railway ascends a little over 2,500 feet. The descent takes almost 100 miles to the north. A very easy grade going south, very rugged grade going north. 2 steam engines are still available on the White Pass and Yukon and do operate occasionally. The bridge in the background has actually been supplanted now by a more modern bridge, but it's still there. That was the greatest engineering feat of the long ascent. These are pictures again from a visit we had in 2006. Is the White Pass summit, elevation 2,888 feet, about 400 feet lower than the Chilkoot Pass. And here's Lake Bennett. This is actually, again, the headwaters of the mighty Yukon River, which goes almost 2,000 miles to the Pacific from here. But the great strikes were at Dawson, which was, again, about 500 miles up the river from what would be Whitehorse and about 600 from here. Now, you see the station, which has a restaurant in it, famous for moose stew and hot buns. This is a charter train that we had for one of our tours in 2006, which again was able to do run-bys for us, which was great. So the buildings of the Canadian National Park Service at Lake Bennett. This church was built by the miners during the winter of 1898. They couldn't go down the river until the ice broke. So they spent the river building this magnificent church. It was used for about 1 year only, but they built it well. It's still standing to this day. They built these boats, which were kind of like lifeboats, but were capable of having masts put up and were pretty sturdily built. And literally, again, you floated basically 600 miles, but a lot of it was rapids down to Dawson. One of my clients was nice enough to get a picture of me on the open platform there. White Pass and Yukon owns an amazing fleet of equipment with locomotives that dated from many of the Colorado narrow gauge railways, from the Sumter Valley Railroad, coaches from narrow gauge lines that were discontinued as long ago as 1918. They've got at least 2 coaches from the Catskill Mountain Railroad in New York. Some of the East Broadtop, others they built themselves. This was August, but August is the peak of the fall color in the Yukon, and it was magnificent color. We're heading for Carcross, which is at about mile 67. Now, the railway continues another 50 miles to Whitehorse, but that portion hasn't been operated since the late 1980s because a paved highway opened right next to it and basically sucked off the traffic. The steamer was owned by the White Pass and Yukon. They had 2 fleets of steamers, one on the lakes outside of Carcross to reach less known but significant mine diggings, and the other below Whitehorse, because the train would take as far as Whitehorse, where those went to Dawson. The U.S. Northern Steamboat Company ran steamers all the way 1,700 miles out to the Pacific Ocean, Bering Sea interseas north of Nome. But that service ended about 1923. The Tutshai was in service into the 1950s. And she's preserved there at Carcross, and you can tour her. And then we get to another gap. Mentioned earlier, the British Columbia Railway had dreams and almost lived to fulfill them of getting to Whitehorse with the standard gauge line, only to be forced to walk away from it without ever completing it. The Alaska Road itself has actually begun to push a bit to the east. They've built a new main line about 80 miles east out of Fairbanks, but they've still got 700 or 800 to go to connect into the North American Railway network. Instead, there was one of the most rugged stretches of the Alaska Highway, sort of thing you see along the Alaska Highway. These are the real rulers of it. Denali, the great one, Mount McKinley. I was in Alaska on 6 different occasions when I might have seen the mountain before I did finally see it. And all I can say is it's worth waiting. Looking down the Alaska Highway towards the Alaska Range. On the right, Mount McKinley, which is the highest peak in North America, over 20,000 feet. The first significant long-distance standard gauge line to be completed in Alaska was the Copper River Northwestern. This was a project of the Guggenheim and Morgan Associates to reach rich copper mines at Kennecott, Alaska, and originally, at least, to also reach coal mines to the north and on to push on in the direction of the Yukon River. The only line that was ever completed was the line from Cordova on the Gulf of Alaska to Kennecott. This line was 196 miles long when finished. Construction started in 1909 and was completed in 1911. They put a lot into it. Incredible engineering. First 45 miles were pretty deceptively gentle, but at the Miles Glacier, it began to meet its first major targets. This is the country it would be built through. Long trestle work at the ocean to connect the railway into the steamers that would take out the ore. This is a rotary snowplow train getting ready to go up the main line and break it open. Now, this was the first great engineering landmark. This is what they call the $1 Million Bridge, although it actually cost $1.5 million. If you look just above the bridge, that mass of white is 2 glaciers. And just as the bridge was being completed in 1910, one of them surged to within 1,500 feet of the bridge, and it looked like they were going to sweep away the bridge. Miraculously, the winter came, the glacier stopped advancing, and in the spring it retreated, and now it's about 1.5 miles from the bridges. But almost took this out. This was only the beginning of the Copper River Northwestern's problems with glaciers, however. Here's a spot about 30 miles further along on the line where they had to cross the moraine of a glacier, the lateral moraine. That's the gravel along the side of a glacier, and they had to build a tunnel through it. Problem there was, of course, the glacier was continuously moving, and so the track had to be relayed several times a season if the glacier was particularly active. Further along the magnificent Abercrombie Canyon, along the Copper River, incredible scenery in this district. This was all to have been converted into a highway, but it never got finished, alas. It's the kind of trestle work they had to build to get through the country. Now, on the left here is the second bridge over the Copper River at Chitina, about 2/3 of the way up the line. And this looks like something out of a model railroad. If you look at the steepness of this grade dropping down to the river, it's actually 2 rivers coming together there, the Chitina River and the Copper River. And every spring, without fail, the lower part of this bridge was washed out, and the road had to rebuild it every year, interrupting service, of course, for a couple of weeks at a time. And it had this amazing ramp down, which if you had it in your model railroad, would be described as really inauthentic, but it was the real thing. They had to do it over and over again to keep the line open. This is the Gilhania River trestle, and this still stands, although you can't drive or walk over it. It is so shaky. But this stands about 20 miles east of McCarthy, where the gateway town to the mines themselves. The highway just barely bypasses this. The Great Alaska Earthquake of 1964 knocked down the $1 Million Bridge and also knocked down the road bridges in the same country. This is a highway attempt to get into the area around the Kennecott Glacier from the south. This road was never completed, and after the destruction from the earthquake, it was simply left in place like this. Here is the Kennecott River, almost up to the Kennecott mines. And by the time I got there in 1978, this is how you got across the river. You literally pulled yourself across on a hand-pulled cable car. Now, in fact, I will confess, I flew in with my friend Huntley Dent, and we used a bush plane to get in. But we went back down from Kennecott to see this, and I pulled myself out about probably 50 yards toward the river and a little ways over it when I realized, oh my God, if I go any further, I'll never get back. Now you can see the fuel truck over there. The river wasn't really all that deep. You could, when the water was low, drive through it. But this also was a spot where the railroad's bridge kept getting washed out and required rebuilding every year. This went on from the completion of the line in 1911 to 1939. Through most of its history, the Copper River Northwestern ran year-round, although in the winter, freight trains would appear with mixed train coaches on them once or twice a week at most. But in summer, this actually participated in tourism, especially after the completion of the Alaska Road in 1923. You could ride one way up to Chitina on the Copper River Northwestern. They had even had dining car service. And then primitive school bus type coaches would take you over to Fairbanks, where you would then ride the Alaska Railway back down to Seward and reboard your cruise ship 150 some miles to the west of Cordova, where you got off in the first place. But by 1938, the Depression was sinking in, and the Guggenheim interests also controlled the Kennecott mine outside of Salt Lake City, Utah, an open pit mine, which was vastly less expensive to run than the one in Alaska. And that's the one they kept. And in May of 1939, the Copper River Northwestern was officially abandoned, although essentially nothing was torn up. We'll deal with some of that shortly. This is the bridge that the railroad had where I'm pulling myself across by cableway, and this again also required constant rebuilding. Now, more recently, the Highway Department of Alaska has built a narrow but modern highway bridge across the Kennecott River. They don't allow passenger cars to drive over to McCarthy and Kennecott unless you have a reason to, visiting someone, but they do have a shuttle service that runs, and most of what was the mine at Kennecott has been made into the center of the Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve. This, however, is McCarthy, which was the railway maintenance town just across the river. These are pictures from 1978. This was the Kennecott mine when it was the height of its glory and still operating. Closed last year for operations was 1938. And this is what it looked like in 1978. And if you look to the left in the mill building there, that's the powerhouse for it. We looked in the window and there was a 1938 calendar still on the wall above the desk of the superintendent. The rails were in place just behind where I'm standing in this picture, and you could throw a switch stand and the switch actually moved. Between McCarthy and Kennecott mines here, when they decided to open up a road, they simply bulldozed the railroad track and shoved them off to the side of the road, and the rails were all still there, twisted and turned, standing upright. This was the dream of the perfect ghost town you dreamed of seeing. One lodge had been converted into a simple hotel where we stayed for 3 days. But the other cabins in some cases have been occupied by squatters effectively, and many of the buildings associated with the mine were, again, exactly as they had been in 1938 when everybody got on the last train and rode out. The hospital still had the beds sheeted. Inside the office, the file cabinet's been dumped over and all this paperwork was all over the floor. This is an example of a work order for someone who was injured as an employee. Patient records were hanging from the bottom of the beds in the hospital. And again, this is 1978, railroad abandoned 1938, do the math. I look very intrepid here with my ice axe, but I can assure you that I cannot, would not, and will not ever climb a glacier. But they gave us this to walk along the moraine and see the incredible view of the frozen waterfall that creates the Kennecott River and ultimately the Copper River, which is on the right. This is in the valley below a glacier, which while we were there, creaked and groaned all night long. I woke up the first night, what is that sound? It was the Kennecott Glacier below moving and creaking and groaning. I was glad I had the ice axe with me. As it turned out, we walked about a mile up from the village to get the great view of the 2,500 foot high wall of ice at the beginning of this, essentially a frozen 2,500 foot high waterfall, because a grizzly bear started to walk down the moraine. And a little creek was coming into the side, and I looked at the grizzly, and the grizzly looked at me and my friend Huntley. And thank God the grizzly was, number one, completely uninterested in us, and number two, turned around and walked away. I don't know what the ice axe would have done, but it might have felt good to have one last chance to fight. Copper River Northwestern, again, was abandoned because of the Depression and because the Kennecott mine in Alaska cost 5 times the amount to run as the comparable Kennecott mine at Salt Lake or the Anaconda mines outside of Butte, Montana. I will tell before we go to the Alaska Road one last story about McCarthy, however. While Huntley and I were there, we hired a local kid who had a taxi to take us on a drive out to see that demolished highway bridge. And while we were out there looking at the highway bridge and getting pictures of the Copper River, he turned to me and said, "You know, I could kill your ass out here and nobody'd ever find you." I remember thinking that was a really weird thing to say. Well, a few years later, in 1983, a guy named Lewis Hastings, who was squatting in a cabin in Kennecott and also was hanging out in McCarthy, decided to go on a murder rampage. One day at lunch, he walked into his neighbor's cabin, shot him, said to the neighbor as he was falling over, "Don't fight me, just let me do this, and you're already dead." I mean, the guy actually wasn't dead. He ran away, ran down to McCarthy nearby, but they couldn't get the alarm out. The nearest Alaska State Troopers were 150 miles away, so they had to get a bush plane and fly out. Lewis Hastings came down cabin by cabin, shooting his neighbors until he had killed 6 and wounded 2. By the time the police arrived about 4 hours later by air, he was about 10 miles out of town, walking across the countryside, and surrendered peacefully. He's doing 600 years in the Alaska State Penitentiary now. But I always remembered that because Alaska prides itself on its extraordinary tolerance of eccentricity and uniqueness. And that's true, but at least in the case of what happened in McCarthy in 1983, one of the problems was the folks who lived there couldn't tell an eccentric from a psychopath. And sadly, they fell victim to a very crazy man indeed. The main Alaska Railroad today was to have been a private for-profit operation. It was chartered about 1906 and began to construct inland from an ocean port at Seward. Didn't get very far. In its first form, the Alaska Central, it went out of business. It was reconstituted as the Alaska Northern in 1909. That lasted till 1915, but only managed to build 20 miles of track and went out of business. And the federal government, which had been subsidizing the cost of construction, came in with what was called the Alaska Road Commissions and surveyed railways all over Alaska, all the way to the Bering Sea, all the way to Nome, but finally concluded the only one that might be viable would be up the Susitna River drainage to what was then Fairbanks. And they gradually constructed it, completing it in 1923. Warren G. Harding, the amiable but corrupt president of the time, came out and drove the Golden Spike. On the way back, he got food poisoning and died very unexpectedly. The rumor was that his wife had poisoned him, which was almost certainly nonsense, but she had discovered that he'd had a child with one of the maids of the White House in a closet. Very embarrassing. The railroad, again, still made no money, not for many, many years. It was 1938 before it ever showed a profit. In World War II, the Alaska Railroad got a gift. Its first 70 miles from Seward in towards Anchorage are actually the most magnificent scenic part of the line, but it had 2 mountain passes and had extended 3% grades, a spiral loop with a spiral trestle in it originally, incredibly expensive to maintain. And Seward Port was open to the sea, and they were afraid the Japanese would come in as they did in the Aleutians. And so they dug a tunnel through to another fjord that was about 40 miles south of Anchorage, at a place called Whittier. And that is where most of the freight to Alaska comes in today, although the road still does handle freight at Seward, and passenger trains to Seward have become quite the thing again after decades of having none. This is the way, and the only train that went to Whittier for many years for pastures, and the only pasture train that ran 12 months of the year. You literally drove your car up in a flat car, and you went about 15 miles through a tunnel and came out on the fjord where you could board a ferry or a ship. This is Whittier. Newport, built again during World War II. Princess Cruises, giant liners can get in there, no problem at all. The Seward line, again, is much less known than the main line between Anchorage and Fairbanks, but I think in truth it is the most magnificent part of the Alaska Road. Coming out of Anchorage to begin, it runs along the fjord for about 45 miles, an area where there's a tidal bore, where the tide literally comes in to form a wall of water. Further down by the Baird Glacier, you got so close to the glacier that the track was virtually touched by its outreach moraine, which you can see here. This is again part of that fjord. There was no passenger service to Seward from 1953 to 1986. During that period, the Alaska Steamer Company Service regular freight passenger line had ceased handling passengers, and the Alaska Marine Highway was primarily taking people to Seward or to Whittier. But in '86, the Alaska Railroad bought Bud cars from down in the lower 48 and decided to experiment with restoring service to Seward. We chartered this excursion train in June of '86 in conjunction with a tour of Alaska that began actually at the World's Fair, Expo '86 down in Vancouver. And this was the first passenger train into Seward since 1953. Very proud of that. Although, ironically, the regular one was only about half an hour behind us that day. And most of the railfan pictures that showed the first train to Seward were actually pictures of my charter. The real one, the scheduled one, was about half an hour again behind us. These Bud cars now are in Portland, Oregon, as the reserve equipment for the West Side Express, a heavy rail DMU operated commuter service on the west side of Portland. But for many years, they served Alaska, not only to Seward, but also to serve the fishermen's trains that went up towards the Hurricane Viaduct north of Anchorage. This is the area that originally had the complete spiral. In later years, when the glacier in the foreground there retreated about actually a half a mile from the track, they were able to reconfigure it to get rid of the actual loop trestle. But there's still a remarkable set of horseshoe curves, and you can see one of them here in this picture. This again is the Cook Inlet Fjord south of Anchorage. And on the right is the tidal bore. The tide goes out and leaving half a mile of mudflats. But when it comes back in and is shrunk down by a peninsula you see on the left there that goes about a mile out into the fjord. And that creates a tidal bore, a wall of water that literally surges at 20 to 30 miles an hour up the fjord. If you were walking on those mudflats and the tidal bore got to you, you're dead. No possibility you could escape it. And there's quicksand all through those mudflats. Anchorage is a port today, but it is a struggling one. The waters really aren't deep enough consistently to provide open ocean service, and most of the cruise passengers go either to Whittier or Seward. Now, the Buds are long gone from the Seward service. Today, the Alaska Railroad runs full-service locomotive haul trains to Seward, both entirely for cruise passengers and also others open to the public. Everyone has heard about taking the Alaska Railroad from Anchorage to Fairbanks, and it is a really magnificent ride. But the great event is to see the mountain, Mount McKinley, to see Denali. And again, it was the 6th time I'd had a shot of seeing it on 3 visits to Alaska before I actually got a look at it. But I will say it was worth waiting. These are custom-built full-length dome cars that were done by Colorado Railcar for the Alaska Railroad. These were among the last cars that Colorado Railcar ever built. Sadly, they went bankrupt when, among other things, Vermont failed to follow through on an order for new self-propelled DMUs that we had promised to do in conjunction with Amtrak, but then sat on the order for 3 years, and eventually they went broke waiting for the contract. But Colorado Railcar, originally known as Raider Railcar, had built most of the double-decker cars like this for the Rocky Mountaineer down near Vancouver. But the Alaska ones are even more spectacular. They had outdoor platform you could stand on. The lower level is a dining room with a full kitchen. The upper area, again, is a luxurious reclining seat vista area. The Alaska Road had regular domes as well, at least after the Union Pacific joined Amtrak, they did. These again are pictures from my first visit to Alaska in 1978. And these were domes from the Union Pacific's Challenger, which had been sold to the Alaska Railroad along with UP diners, coffee shop cars, and leg rest coaches, and moved up to Alaska to replace the railroad's original post-World War II streamliner fleet, which was actually converted U.S. Army hospital cars that, thank God, had never been used for that purpose during the Second World War. Dome cars galore in Alaska. Today, the ARR has not only its own double-decker cars, but it also has former Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and Union Pacific short domes, and full-length dome cars belonging to Holland America Line, Royal Caribbean Cruises, Princess Cruises, and its own, again, double-decker cars from Colorado Railcar that we saw. This was the summer, August 2006, Maine Alaska Railroad Anchorage to Fairbanks dome liner. We had 19 dome cars on the train the day I took these pictures. Vast magnificence of the Alaska interior. Not October, fall color in the latter part of August, but the tundra turns stunningly beautiful as it goes on toward fall. At the time we were there, the most important freight traffic on the Alaska Road was coal, going again to the Orient, mostly to Korea. But these mines now have closed, and the railway is handling mostly container freight for Alaska. The mines aren't played out, but at the moment, the coal business is minor. Pasture business, however, is profitable and runs year-round, which it didn't for many years. In the winter, there was only a once-a-week train up to some isolated areas in the interior. Now there is at least weekly service to Fairbanks throughout the year, and in certain months of the winter, it's 4 days a week. This is the Nenana River Canyon north of Denali National Park Station. It's the train in 1978 coming into Denali Park Station. There was a cool and unexpected clipboard on the wall inside Denali Station in 78. It was a sign-up sheet for dead moose. The train is affectionately known to the locals as the Moose Gooser, because in the winter, the movement of the trains blows the snow off the track, and the moose can get in and find the browsing easier. But they are literally the king of the world, and they're too stupid to get out of the way of the trains. The trains keep killing them. The railroad tried everything, cattle prods with an engineer up on the cow catcher to goose them. That didn't do it. Now they would load the corpses into the baggage car and dump them on the platform at Denali Station, which was not open significantly as a station in the winter, but there were lots of people living in cabins nearby. And basically it was an honor system. Your name was next on the dead moose list, you got the latest kill. And typically every time a train went by, the one or two or more were on the train, so plenty of moose. The moose problem continues to this day. They have never figured out a perfect solution to it. This canyon again is just north of Denali Park Station. Just south of it is the highest bridge on the Alaska Road. Here's Nenana Station. This is actually where the Golden Spike was driven in 23 by Warren G. Harding. And here's a view of Denali, the Great One, from the train, about 40 miles north of Denali Park Station. Again, the magnificent world's longest dome liner, UP car in 78, the new Fairbanks terminal in 78, which had just opened then. Notice it says Department of Transportation. Until the mid-80s, the Alaska Road belonged to the U.S. Department of Transportation. Then it was sold to the state of Alaska. It is profitable for passenger service, which is quite extraordinary, at least in the summertime. And it disproves the argument we all make that you can't make money on dining car service. The Alaska Road has franchised out the diners, but they are actually run by a catering service out of Anchorage, and they're run without direct subsidy, except for the fact that the caterer does not get charged to move the car, which would be the case if they were on Amtrak. Now here's a short gold mining railway up at Fairbanks, evoking the Tanana River line, the one I showed you that went to Chitina to the north of Fairbanks and down to Tanana and Nenana south of it, which was later incorporated into Alaska Road main line. This looks like a steamboat, but it's actually a dredge for dredging gold out of the muck flats north of Fairbanks. This is the Alaska pipeline, the new gold of Alaska. It's taken from the highway about 25 miles north of Fairbanks. The area was once crisscrossed by steamboats. As I mentioned, the Alaska Road itself ran steamboats 500 and 600 miles down the Yukon River system from the connection to the railway at Nenana. Service they continued in 1953. This is the Discovery, which runs short day cruises out of Fairbanks, but she's a true stern-wheeler. And there have been two earlier generations of this vessel, and they're all tied up together on the river just outside of Fairbanks on the Tanana River. At one point, you stop at a remote bush camp, and you can actually take a summer dog sled ride on a wheeled sled. Susan Butcher, the woman who won the Iditarod more times than any other racer, was actually running that operation the last time I was there, although I think it's somebody else's place they're visiting now. You also get to visit a native Indian camp where they show you how salmon are smoked, among other things. The rivers are no longer the highway of interior Alaska. They're not dredged any longer. But for decades, again, the Yukon system had steamboats on it at one time all the way from Whitehorse, 1,700 miles to the Pacific. Now, a look at a couple of the eccentric little railways. This is the Yakutat Southern, also called the Situk Railway, the railway that ran by the tide. This served two kinds of traffic, a sawmill and also a fish cannery. And it could only operate when the tide was full, because only at high tide could the boats get in to take the materials off the train. This ran for almost 60 years, didn't shut down until the mid-1960s, and all the equipment's still up there. There was no fare to go as a passenger, as long as you understood that you were basically going to ride in this sort of unique self-propelled thing that was the only coach they had, and also for a while the locomotive. You can see a steam engine, a little sort of dinky on the right, and then this weird-looking rail car that they had. Way out at Nome, the Wild Goose Railway, later the Nome Arctic Railway, then various other names, until ultimately trying to revive as a tourist road in the 1950s. It was the Seward Peninsula Railway, and then finally the Nome Alaska Arctic Railway. This was never officially abandoned. They just sort of walked away. The rails were left in place. I was there in 1978, and I have not been back since. These are not my pictures. These are rail pictures from Clio, as you can see down at the bottom. But I will say that when I went out to Nome in the 70s, there was still track in places, and there was still some equipment around. And my understanding is this rusty pile of dying steam engines is still rusting away there to this day. But here's the dream at last of a railway all the way to Alaska. If this is ever constructed, this will be the main route back down to the lower 48, and the way that the wealth of the interior will finally get to North America without having to be moved by train and ship. You see the line to North Pole and Delta Junction. That part has been completed by the Alaska Railroad, but the rest of it remains speculative. And interestingly, this map shows it going north of Whitehorse, and possibly that would serve the Dawson area, although they don't show that. Eventually, the target is Edmonton. But I think if built, this is likely to end up connecting to the British Columbia Railway, either somewhere around Fort Nelson or finally completing the Dease Lake line. This is a dream, but it is an active dream. They're trying to raise money for it, and who knows? Remember the film years ago, North to Alaska? Perhaps we'll finally be able to take the train north to Alaska. So with that, thank you. That's my show. And I'm happy to take some questions if there are any.
Well, Carl, before we get any questions, I'll just start by saying thank you for presenting to us tonight.
My pleasure. Hope that was fun. I'm sorry for the wacko behavior of Zoom, but we all know that Zoom is nothing if not zoomy sometimes.
Happens to the best of us.
Yep.
Does anyone have any questions?
You can, of course, still ride the White Pass and Yukon and the whole of the Alaska Railroad main line, except the portion from Fairbanks heading down toward the lower 48. That's still to have its first public passenger train. But the White Pass and Yukon is open again, at least as far as Carcross. The northern part to Whitehorse hasn't run since about 1987, and I doubt it ever will again. But it's there. It's in place, in situ, as the Brits would say. And the Grand Trunk Pacific is there. And the northern part of the British Columbia Railway, north of Prince George, is in regular freight operation. But again, the only passenger train is the once weekly Rocky Mountaineer service, and that went to Jasper and is suspended because of the terrible fires this summer at Jasper. The Skeena is running the west end from Prince George to Prince Rupert, but the east end is suspended probably until October. They think they'll be able to stop in Jasper in October. VIA, interestingly, has resumed service through Jasper National Park. They always changed engines at Jasper, fueled the train, washed the dome car windows, changed the crews. They can't do that now because of the fire, but they've moved to a place called Hinton, Alberta, which is about 40 miles to the east, and they're doing the change on a highway crossing as far as the fueling is concerned. And of course, they can't wash the windows, but the Canadian is running through to Vancouver again, kind of. But again, in Jasper Park, because more than half the town site burned, they can't yet get back in there. Although interestingly, the train station did not burn. They initially thought it did, but it didn't. And the magnificent Canadian National Steam engine there at the station wasn't damaged either, nor was the stored train set of the Skeena, which was in the yards. They all escaped. And nor was the magnificent Jasper Park Lodge destroyed, although it did apparently lose some outbuildings.
Yeah, I have a question. You had mentioned that Grand Trunk Pacific, the promoter was planning a line from Montreal to Portland, Maine. Is that different than the
Yep,
plan?
George Melville Hayes, same guy.
Yeah, that's, I mean, there was the Grand Trunk Railroad.
Yep.
That was built early, so this would be another line?
Yeah, he was, the line to Portland would have been supplanted by an even shorter main line to Providence. A great book on that called Titanic Railroad, because of course, Mr. Hayes went down on the Titanic. He was carrying bonds that you could carry with you in cash, and they went down with him. The railway went bankrupt almost immediately. There were two completely separate Grand Trunk systems. The Grand Trunk Pacific, which was going from Winnipeg to Prince Rupert, being built so close to the Canadian Northern, also over Yellowhead Pass west of Jasper, that you practically looked like a double track railroad in places. Those both became Canadian National. But when Hayes went down, the dream had been completed to Rupert, but he had plans for a magnificent 300-room grand hotel at Prince Rupert. There was going to be another fabulous railway hotel at Prince George. None of those ever got built. The Jasper Park Lodge was completed as a sort of camping camp originally. It's now the fanciest log cabin you'll ever stay at in the world, but the railway to Providence was never completed. Out in the backwoods in Connecticut, if you know where to look, there are some stone bridges that were completed, but no rail was ever laid on them. And again, if you're interested in learning about that, look for the book Titanic Railroad, which tells that story.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
No relation to the ship Titanic.
Well, it's because Hayes was on the railroad, on the ship when he died. So
Huh.
coming back from raising money in Europe, which had been very successful, but because the bonds were literally the equivalent of cash, they were called bearer bonds. If the bonds went down with him, the money was lost with him. So literally all the money to complete the projects went down on the Titanic with the builder, George Melville Hayes, thus the name Titanic Railroad. It's a sarcasm and an irony, obviously, but it's kind of cool. The original Grand Trunk line was the main line of Canada, basically extending from Montreal to the US border at Sarnia, Michigan, and Windsor, with spurs like the winter season all-weather route to the port of Portland, Maine, which still exists to this day as the St. Lawrence and Atlantic. That was originally part of the Grand Trunk system, but again, his Eastern Dream Railroad never got finished. It would have been a connection on the north end of the Central Vermont Railway, which later was run by the Grand Trunk Corporation after it had all been wrapped into Canadian National Railway's sort of giant holding company, which held all sorts of other railroads, smaller railroads.
This is an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would think you mentioned at the end of your presentation about building the railway from Alaska to the lower 48. I think that would be an excellent idea. One, for national security. Secondly, is it would open up development of Alaska big time.
Yep.
And
And
I
it's,
think,
it's a
I
dream
think,
for 50 years. I mean,
yeah, and I think that with the end of the fossil fuel that everybody's pushing for, which will devastate Alaska financially, but I think the rail line from the states up there would be a boom to their economy in the long term.
yeah, the railroad itself has already lost, as I mentioned, most of coal traffic. It hasn't been hauling a lot of petroleum except jet fuel for the airports, which is a significant freight traffic source for the railway. But the great minds of finance never seem to see that railway as finally a very good idea, and it never quite gets done. The Copper River Northwesterns and various extensions, which would have tripled its mileage if built, mostly went into coal fields in the Alaska interior, which were locked up by Teddy Roosevelt and have never been unlocked.
I didn't know they had coal fields up there.
Oh, they had a lot of coal up there. But it's dirty coal. The stuff that you don't really want to burn much of, but it's there. And it was good coal for power plants. Again, the stuff that went to Seward was heading for power plants and steel mills in China and in Korea primarily, but also to some degree to Japan.
Again, very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've done a couple of earlier presentations for the 470 Club, and I'd be happy to come back again if you'd like to see something else.
Any last minute questions out there? All right, cool. Carl, thank you very much for taking time out of your Wednesday evening to present for us. We really appreciate it.
It's fun.
We are definitely going to be reaching out for maybe another presentation here in the future. So you'll probably be getting an email from us, but you know, these are kind of the things we like to see with the whole group, you know, getting people involved, asking questions, you know, conversations. It's really what we want to, you know, see. But again, we try to wait to the end, obviously, so we can get the presentation through. But you know, good questions, good comments from people. It's really cool to see, you know, the different questions that people have had. So again, Carl, we really appreciate it. And any last minute questions before we log off?
I will see you then.
Yeah, I got
later.
I have one. So was your driver in McCarthy the murderer?
No. Sound
was
I
not.
I gave that impression, but he wasn't. I thought for years he was, but I discovered recently he had only moved to McCarthy about 6 months before he killed everybody.
Ah, okay.
There were
Interesting.
in summer about 30 residents. In the winter, when he committed his crime, there were about 18, and he injured or killed 8 of them.
Wow.
Didn't leave a lot of residents. But no, it wasn't him. As I said, if you'd asked me that question 3 years ago, I told you it was, because it seemed obvious that the kid making that weird, bizarre statement to us had to be the guy who later did. He was already thinking about it, but it wasn't. The guy was actually a defrock programmer who, after getting fired from the early tech world, very early tech world, moved up to Alaska and unfortunately went completely bonkers.
Huh. Well, thank you for his great presentation. Really interesting. Thank you.
Pleasure. Anybody else? Well, with that, I'm going to sign off on you and wish you well.
Carl, thank you very much again. We really appreciate it. You'll be getting